The evening wind whistled through the broken boards of the saloon walls, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and long-forgotten whiskey. A lantern swung lazily from a cracked beam, its light trembling over the floorboards, where footprints and spilled liquor mixed into muddy stains. Outside, the desert stretched silent and endless, a world of red rock and bone-colored sand that swallowed the sun hours ago. Inside, every face was watching her. She stood near the doorway, young, pale beneath the smoky lamplight. Her hands pressed together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The widow's voice cut through the murmurs like the edge of a knife. "Choose a man, he'll be yours for one night," she said with that slow, dangerous smile only women who had seen too much could wear. Then her hand, adorned with a dull silver ring, rose and pointed toward the corner. Chains clinked. There, half hidden in the shadows, stood the Apache. His wrists were bound in iron, the weight of the chains heavy against his bare chest. The light caught the copper in his skin and the cold fire in his eyes that didn't plead, didn't flinch, didn't belong to a man broken by captivity. He stood tall, despite the restraint, the kind of defiance that made men uneasy and women silent. The air seemed to tighten around him as if the whole room were holding its breath. The widow's smile deepened. "He was captured near the river 2 nights ago," she said. "A raider, they say. Killer, perhaps. But tonight?" Her gaze drifted toward the young woman by the door. "Tonight he belongs to whoever dares." A few men chuckled, their laughter nervous, forced. Some looked away, pretending not to care. But no one missed the way the stranger's eyes moved slowly, deliberately, to meet hers. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. She had come to the saloon because she had nowhere else to go. The storm outside had caught her wagon in the dry gulch, and the horses had bolted. Mud streaked the hem of her dress, and her hair, once carefully pinned, now clung to her face in wild, damp strands. She didn't belong in a place like this, not among the outlaws and broken men that filled the widow's hall. Yet here she was, trembling under the gaze of a chained warrior. Someone whispered her name, warning her not to do something foolish. But she barely heard them. There was something in his eyes, not cruelty, not anger, but something older, heavier. It felt like the silence before thunder, a stillness that carried both danger and promise. She couldn't look away. The widow's voice snapped again, teasing. Well, will no one take him?" The room stirred. The soldiers at the back shifted uneasily. They'd caught the Apache themselves and weren't too keen to see him toyed with like a prize, yet none spoke up. The law out here was whatever the widow said it was, and she had a way of making men listen. The young woman's breath trembled in her chest. She didn't want this, not really. But some invisible thread pulled her closer, something stronger than fear, something that made her take one step, then another. The wooden floor groaned beneath her boots. The widow's laughter echoed softly. The brave little dove steps forward. Every eye followed her as she crossed the room. The Apache didn't move, but his gaze tracked her every step, calm, dark, unreadable. When she stopped before him, she realized how tall he was, how the iron collar around his neck cut into his skin, how the shadows played against the muscles of his arms. He looked more like a force of nature than a man, forged from the same earth and fire that carved the canyon walls. The widow approached, keys jingling in her hand. "Go on then," she said, voice dripping with amusement. "Claim your prize." The young woman hesitated. "Why do you keep him like this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The widow's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "Because men like him don't bow to anyone unless they're made to." Her fingers brushed the cold metal key, but she didn't turn it yet. The girl's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it echo in her ears. "I don't want a man who's forced," she said quietly. The room fell silent. The widow's smile faltered for a moment, then curved again, sharper this time. "Then you'd better hope he chooses not to kill you when the chains come off." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd, but the young woman didn't flinch. She lifted her chin slightly, her blue eyes steady. "Unlock him." The sound of the key turning in the lock was deafening. The chain fell away with a metallic thud that made even the soldiers shift back. The Apache rubbed his wrists once, the faintest trace of blood on his skin, then looked at her again. Not a word passed his lips.
"Outside."
Thunder rolled in the distance. He took one step toward her. She didn't move. Another step, and she could feel his breath warm and heavy. Carrying the scent of smoke and iron, her instincts screamed to run, yet something inside her refused. The widow leaned against the counter, watching with delight. "Careful, dear," she purred. "A wild heart can't be tamed with kindness." But the young woman wasn't listening. She looked up into his eyes and saw not a beast, but a storm trapped behind walls. "What do they call you?" she asked softly. He didn't answer. His gaze flicked toward the door, then back to her. For a long moment, they stood in that fragile silence, two strangers bound by something neither could name. Then the widow clapped her hands. "Enough staring. Take him, girl. He's yours till dawn." Her words broke the spell. The crowd began to murmur again, men reaching for their drinks, women smirking behind fans, pretending not to care while watching every move. The young woman turned slightly, meaning to speak, to protest, but the Apache's hand caught her wrist. Not hard, but firm enough to stop her. His touch was rough, his skin warm against hers. She froze. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. "Don't," she whispered. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying an accent thick with the cadence of the plains. "You shouldn't be here." Her breath hitched. "Neither should you." Something flickered across his face, a shadow of pain or maybe memory. He released her wrist slowly, his hand falling to his side. The widow sighed theatrically. "You two can trade poetry later. The night's wasting." A gust of wind burst through the door, scattering dust across the floor. Somewhere outside, a horse neighed, restless. The Apache looked toward the sound, his eyes narrowing. The soldiers who had captured him were still drinking, too drunk to notice the change in the air, but she did. "Someone's coming," she whispered. The Apache turned his head slightly, listening. "Not someone," he murmured. "Many." The widow frowned, her amusement fading. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, the faint echo of drums rolled across the wind, distant, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the desert itself. The color drained from the soldiers' faces. The widow's voice trembled for the first time that night. Apache wore drums. The man in chains straightened his back, his expression unreadable. "They come for their own," he said quietly. And for the first time, the young woman saw it. Not defiance, not pride, but the calm of a man who knew his fate. Outside. The thunder grew louder, blending with the drums until the walls themselves seemed to tremble. The widow grabbed a rifle from behind the bar. "Get him back in chains," she shouted, but no one moved. The Apache didn't struggle, simply looked at the young woman, that same steady look that had silenced her when they first met, and said in a voice that barely carried above the storm, "You freed me. Now you must choose if you'll live with that." The lightning flashed, throwing his face into sharp relief, his eyes burning with something fierce and ancient. She took a step back, torn between fear and something far more dangerous, curiosity. The door burst open, the wind screaming through the saloon. And as the first arrow struck the wood beside her, she realized the night's bargain had only just begun. The wind howled through the broken door, scattering sand and smoke into the air. The flames from the lanterns flickered wildly, throwing long shadows across the walls. The soldiers lunged for their rifles, but their hands shook too much to load them. The widow barked orders, her voice roughened by fear, yet she didn't move closer to the chained Apache. She knew well that when the desert cried like this, death was close behind. The young woman stood frozen in the chaos, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could still feel the warmth of his hand on her wrist, the memory of his words echoing in her head. She didn't know why she freed him. Maybe it was pity, or maybe something deeper that she didn't understand. But now, with the sound of war drums growing louder outside, she wondered if that single act had sealed her fate. The Apache didn't flinch as the arrow struck the door again. He stood tall, his dark hair whipping around his face. His eyes were calm, fixed on the storm beyond the broken walls. He wasn't afraid. If anything, he looked like he'd been waiting for this moment. The widow turned toward him, her hand tightening on the rifle. "Call them off," she demanded. "Tell your people to stop before we all die in this godforsaken place." He didn't answer. His gaze met hers, steady and unblinking. "They won't stop," he said quietly. "Not until they see the truth." "What truth?" she snapped. He looked toward the young woman. That the chains are broken. A silence fell, heavy and strange. The girl's throat tightened. She didn't understand what he meant, but something in his tone made her chest ache. Outside, the drumming grew closer, joined by the distant sound of hooves. The men in the saloon began to panic. One bolted for the back door, only to be met with a scream and the whistle of an arrow cutting through the night. He fell without a sound. The widow swore under her breath, dragging a table toward the window and tipping it for cover. "We'll hold them off," she hissed, shoving ammunition toward the soldiers. "They'll not take this place alive." The young woman stumbled backward, her eyes darting from the door to the Apache. "They'll kill us all," she whispered. "They'll kill you too." He turned toward her then, and for the first time, she saw a shadow of sorrow in his eyes. "If they find me in chains, they'll see only shame," he said. "But if they find me standing, they'll remember who I was." The words struck her deeper than she expected. He wasn't fighting for vengeance. He was fighting for dignity, for something no chain could take from him. A sudden crash shook the saloon as one of the windows shattered. The soldiers fired blindly into the night, the flashes of gunfire lighting up their terrified faces. The widow cursed, ordering them to reload faster. The young woman ducked behind a beam, her hands over her ears, trembling as splinters rained down from the ceiling. Through the noise and smoke, the Apache moved silently. His chains lay forgotten on the floor as he walked toward the back wall, eyes searching. He knew this building. He had seen its kind before, a place built by settlers who thought wood could stand against the desert. He found what he was looking for, a loose plank near the corner where the light spilled through. "Come," he said softly. The young woman hesitated. "Where?" "Out," he said, his tone calm but urgent. "If you stay, you'll die." The widow saw them moving and shouted, "You'll not take her." But before she could raise her rifle, a bullet from outside shattered the lamp above her. Flames licked the ceiling, smoke filling the air. The room erupted into chaos once more. The Apache grabbed the young woman's arm and pulled her toward the wall. She stumbled after him, coughing, her eyes burning from the smoke. He kicked the plank loose with a single blow, and the cold night air rushed in. Beyond it was darkness, the open desert, and the promise of escape. "Go," he said. She shook her head. "Not without you." He paused for the briefest moment, then nodded once. "Then stay close." They slipped out into the night just as the fire caught the whiskey-soaked floorboards behind them. The sound of gunfire and shouting faded as they moved through the narrow canyon behind the saloon. The moonlight cut across the rocks, painting the sand in silver. Every step echoed like thunder in her ears. After what felt like hours, they stopped at a ridge overlooking the valley. From there, she could see the flicker of fire in the distance, the saloon burning, smoke twisting into the night sky. She thought of the widow, the men inside, the heat of the flames. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt only the heavy weight of what they'd left behind. The Apache stood beside her, watching the fire. "That place was built on blood," he said quietly. "It was never meant to stand." She looked at him. "They'll come after us." "Yes," he said, "but not tonight." The night was cold now, and she shivered. He noticed, but said nothing, simply took the cloak from his shoulder and draped it over her. It smelled faintly of smoke and dust, but it was warm. "Why did they chain you?" she asked after a while, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed on the horizon, where the first light of dawn barely touched the desert. When he spoke, his voice was low. "They said I led raids, that I burned their wagons and took their cattle. Maybe some of it was true. But I was not the only one fighting." "Fighting for what?" "For what was ours," he said simply. "Before they came with fences and fire." The words lingered between them. She wanted to ask more, to understand, but there was something in his tone that stopped her. It wasn't anger, it was grief, quiet and deep. As they walked further from the burning town, she began to notice how he moved, not with fear or haste, but with a kind of purpose. Every step was sure, every glance measured. He knew the land like he'd been born from it. By morning, they reached a dry creek bed, lined with twisted mesquite trees. The Apache stopped there, kneeling to touch the ground. His fingers brushed the dirt lightly, then he stood. "They were here," he said. "Who?" she asked. "My people," he replied. "They passed through not long ago." Her heart tightened. "Will they come for you?" He looked at her, the faintest trace of a smile touching his lips. "They already have." Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of distant hoofbeats drifted through the air. She turned, searching the horizon, but he didn't move. He stood perfectly still, listening. The wind carried voices, faint, low, speaking in a language she didn't understand. He turned toward her. "You should hide." She shook her head. "No, I won't leave you." "You don't understand," he said, his tone heavier now. "They will not see you as a friend." "And what about you?" she asked. "Will they see you as one of them after being in chains?" His jaw tightened. "That's what I must find out." The tension hung between them like the desert heat. He took a step back, scanning the ridge, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. The hoofbeats grew louder. She crouched beside a rock, her heart pounding as riders appeared against the morning sun, a small band of warriors. Their silhouettes sharp and proud against the light. The Apache lifted his hand in signal. They slowed but didn't lower their weapons. The air filled with the sound of leather, of wind through feathers and beads. One of the riders called out to him in their tongue. The Apache replied, his voice calm. They spoke back and forth, the rhythm quick and tense. The young woman couldn't understand a word, but she could read the expressions. Suspicion, disbelief, anger. Then one of the riders pointed at her. The others murmured, their faces darkening. The Apache's tone hardened. He stepped slightly in front of her. She didn't move, though her knees trembled. For a moment, it looked like they might turn their spears toward both of them. But then the leader, an older man with gray streaks in his hair, lowered his weapon. He spoke again, slower this time, and the others followed his lead. When it was over, the Apache turned back to her. "They'll let us go," he said quietly. "For now," she exhaled shakily. "They don't trust me. They don't trust anyone who walks from the other side," he said. "And you?" She asked softly, "Do you?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You freed me when no one else would. That is enough." For now the sun climbed higher, burning away the last trace of the night. The fire from the town was only smoke now, drifting faintly across the horizon. The young woman pulled the cloak tighter around her shoulders, feeling the weight of everything unspoken between them. The Apache started walking again, and she followed, her steps uncertain but steady. She didn't know where they were going, or what waited beyond the next ridge. But she knew one thing. The world she had known was gone, burned away with the saloon and its shadows. Ahead lay something she couldn't yet name, danger, redemption, or both. And as the desert wind rose again, carrying the faint echo of drums far behind them, she couldn't help but feel that their story was only beginning. The sun was high when they reached the Badlands, and the land shimmered with heat the way a forge does when the bellows work too hard. The Apache led the way along a shelf of rock that broke like a blade over a wide basin. He paced without hurry, reading small signs the young woman could not see. A feather caught on a thorn. A stone turned so the pale side faced up. He said little, yet every so often he glanced back to make sure she still followed. She kept the cloak tight and pressed on, the soles of her boots aching from the long miles. The smoke from the burned saloon thinned to a faint smear. The frontier was a vast table, and they were 2 crumbs pushed to its edge. The main conflict settled around them like a second sky. The soldiers would not forgive the night in the widow's hall. The riders who had judged them at dawn had not fully pardoned the chained man either. And somewhere behind, the widow waited to count her loss and plan her next wager. The young woman felt all of it pressing at her back as if the wind itself had hands. They stopped in the shadow of a limestone arch at noon. The Apache knelt and drew a map in the dust with the point of his knife. He marked the river with a crooked line and the town with a small square. He tapped the arch twice. "We are here," he said. 2 days north lies the trading post. Soldiers use that road. He drew a circle with the tip, neat as a coin. If we cross the flats after dark, we reach the canyon of red shelves. Water there. Shelter. He raised his eyes. But there is a choice. "What choice?" she asked, though she already knew. "Do we go toward my people and risk their anger for walking with you?" he said. "Or do we turn east and face the men who chained me?" She stared at the little map until it looked like a child's drawing. Why would we turn east? He considered her for a long beat. Because the soldiers will not stop. They will say you aided a raider. The law on the territory is written by men with guns and fences. If they catch you, They will claim you chose the wrong side. She felt her mouth go dry. And if I go to your people, some will say you are a thief of luck. Some will say you are a spy. He let the knife rest across his palm. There is another path. A camp of drifters works the dry riverbed for gold dust. They do not care who brings water or news as long as the tin pans sing. The widow sells supplies to them. She owns the freight wagons. She owns 2 sheriffs by paying their debt. And she is missing one prize. The prize is you, the young woman said. The prize is anyone who kneels when she says so, he replied. I will not kneel. He wiped the map with his hand. The lines vanished as quickly as breath on glass. Eat, he said. We walk again when the light softens. They shared dried meat and a heel of bread from her pack. While they ate, the Apache told her something of his past in pieces, as if each fact were a stone he laid in a row rather than a story he wanted to own. He spoke of a brother who vanished during winter, of a mother who traded baskets at the river, of young men who rode too close to a rancher's herd and brought gunmen down upon them. He did not complain. He did not excuse. The land and the trouble were the same in his telling, both as old as the river bend. When the heat lowered its grip, they moved again. The basin stretched into fields of salt grass and brittle sage. A hawk circled high above them. The Apache said the bird meant guests were near. The young woman asked, "What sort of guests?" He said the kind who did not announce themselves. Toward dusk, they found track signs that were not from the morning riders. These marks bit deeper, iron on hard pan. The Apache crouched and touched a faint crescent in the dirt. Freight wheels, he said. 2 wagons. 1 mule lame on the left rear. Are they from the widow? The young woman asked. She spends money when she expects coin to return, he said. He studied the moon as it rose, a pale stone balanced on the blue edge of the sky. We travel without fire, he added. It is a hungry night. They threaded the flats until stars came. Far off a coyote called. The young woman counted steps to calm her nerves. She had used 2 count stitches when she repaired collars in a small town far away. She had left that town with a promise to start again somewhere the past could not follow. Yet the past had long legs in the frontier. Faces from old days walked beside new ones and did not warn you when they changed names. Near midnight, a glimmer moved along the horizon. The Apache halted and held a hand low, a silent order to drop. She lay flat. Through the sage stems, she saw lanterns bouncing in a slow rhythm. 2 wagons, just as he had said. His men rode beside them with rifles set across saddles. A white scarf fluttered from the lead driver's hat. The wagons rolled toward the same canyon the Apache had marked with his knife. He leaned so close his breath warmed her ear. They carry bodies or barrels, he whispered. Either way, the widow wants none of it seen by daylight. She tasted the dust and dared to ask what he meant. A barrel can be whiskey, he said, or it can be something taken from a grave. There are collectors who will pay for teeth and buttons dug from the ridge where the old massacre was. The widow trades in whatever the railroad men will buy. The thought made the young woman cold, though the night was mild. She asked if he knew the massacre by sight. He nodded once. I do not ride there, he said, but others do. Some from my people look for beads from our grandmothers. Some from the town look for anything that sells. They waited until the wagons passed and the lanterns shrank to sparks. Then they rose and moved along a stony cut. The Apache changed direction and set a faster pace. The young woman sensed a new fear in him, not for himself, but for what the wagons meant. The road that ran under all the others was made of trade, and the widow held the map. At dawn, they reached the edge of the red shelves and hid in a pocket of rock. A thin trickle of water slipped from a ledge and gathered in a shallow pool. They drank there and washed the grit from their faces. The Apache stood at the rim and studied the footprints below. Twice he lifted his chin as if he smelled smoke. The young woman asked what he saw. He said the wagons had turned into the lower gorge and stopped there, then moved out again without light. He said someone had walked the wash on foot and dragged something wrapped in canvas. Said no one had bothered to hide the marks because they believed no one watched. They rested through the heat and spoke little. A vulture drifted over them and settled on a dead branch. The young woman tried not to stare at the bird. To keep her mind steady, she told the Apache what had pushed her onto the trail in the first place. She spoke of a man who swore to marry her and swore again to keep books clean at the freight office, only to vanish with every scrap of savings the town had gathered for a school roof. She had followed rumors, found the trail cold, found work where she could, and kept moving. She did not say she had dreamed of a place that felt like a home. The word was too sharp in her throat. He listened without pity, and then asked, "If you could face that man, would you beg for coin or demand the roof?" "I would demand the roof," she said. "The coin is ash by now." "There will be roofs again," he said. When the light finally bent and shadows began to stretch, they slid down toward the lower gorge. The air cooled and took on the smell of clay. At a bend they found a patch where the ground had been disturbed. The Apache went to one knee and held his palm just above the dirt, not touching it as if heat could pass through empty space. He nodded at a line of fine scratches. "Raven," he said. "He walks with the widow when it suits him. He hunts for the best bidder. He likes to carve his mark." The young woman studied the sign. It looked like a child's letter cut with a dull nail. She asked if Raven was a name or a mask. The Apache said both. He said the man moved easy among camps because he wore other people's words like borrowed coats. He said Raven had been the one to lead the soldiers toward the river while the chained man slept near the reeds with a fever. He said a traitor always keeps two roads. They followed the scratches to a narrow cave in the wall. Inside, the air was cool and smelled like damp ashes. The Apache crouched and lifted a canvas corner with the knife tip. 'Neath it lay a crate with an army stamp, the kind paint could hide under dust. He worked the lid with the blade and showed her the content. Not food, not medicine, not spare boot soles. There were silver candlesticks, a stack of framed paintings, a set of books stamped with a city library seal. A church bell clapper wrapped in cloth lay beside a tin of coins melted together by heat. Loot taken from burned places, goods that walked without receipts across the territory. The widow's trade, proof of the railroad's hunger, made visible. He closed the lid and set the canvas back. "We cannot carry justice like a trunk," he said, "but we can carry truth." They left the cave and climbed to the rim. Dusk rolled toward them like the slow tide 1,000 miles from any sea. On the far side of the gorge, a campfire winked to life among cottonwoods. Voices drifted. The Apache pulled her into the shadow of a boulder. Through a split in the rock, they saw 4 men. One wore the white scarf the young woman had seen the night before. Another leaned his rifle against a trunk and tied a charm to its stock, a black feather that glinted when the flames moved. Raven. A third man bent over a ledger by the fire and sounded out numbers under his breath. The last was tall and carried himself like a sheriff. He took off his hat and wiped his brow, then set the hat back on with the slow care of a man who has chosen a side and cannot step back. The sheriff spoke. The feathered man laughed. The scarf driver tossed a coin and missed the catch, then kicked sand over the miss as if it were a sin. The ledger man read a name. The young woman stiffened. The name was the same as the man who had taken the roof money in the old town. She watched his hand move across the page and felt the ground tilt. The Apache felt her tremble and laid a finger to his lips. They listened. The sheriff told the others that the widow would arrive by morning with a new paper signed by a company agent. Once signed, the wagons would roll to the mountain depot. The paper would say the goods were recovered property. The sheriff would sign witness. The company would hedge its shame with a signature, and the town would blame a wildfire, and all tracks would be swept away by the first sandstorm. Raven asked, "What of the chained Apache who had vanished from the widow's hall?" The sheriff said the warriors would quiet down once the company paid the right headman for a strip of land near the river. He claimed the man in chains had always been a ghost. He raised his tin cup. "Yet ghosts cannot hold a court," he said. The Apache's eyes burned like the coal of a dying fire. He did not move. The young woman felt a hard sorrow press into her ribs. She understood now that the night in the saloon had been a small page in a larger ledger. The conflict was not only between a warrior and a widow, or soldiers and riders. It was a road of power that ran through every hand that took a coin. A new sound turned to all heads, the clop of a lamed mule. The scarf driver cursed and went to calm the animal. In the brief confusion, a packet fell from the ledgerman's coat and landed near the rim of the camp. The paper skittered toward the dark like a leaf. The Apache touched her arm and whispered that this might be the truth they needed. But the drop from their ridge to the floor was steep and bare. One slip would ring like a drum. They waited while the men argued about harness and feed. Then, with a nod, the Apache started down. He moved like water, seeking a crack. The young woman followed, heart beating a wild count. A stone turned under her heel and clicked against another. The sheriff's head jerked. Raven lifted his rifle as lightly as a handkerchief. The Apache froze in shadow. The young woman pressed herself into the rock and did not breathe. Silence stretched so thin, it seemed as if it would tear. Then the lamed mule brayed, a grieving sound that swamped all others. The sheriff cursed again and turned away. Raven lowered the rifle, but kept the feathered charm between two fingers as if weighing a choice. The Apache slid the last few feet, reached the paper, and tucked it under his belt. He looked up to signal to climb back. That was when he saw the young woman's face go still. She had turned toward a small shrine of stone set beside the cottonwood. On it lay a child's shoe and a broken locket she knew well. Her breath left her. The locket had belonged to a girl from her town who had vanished during the freight office scandal. Folks had believed she ran east with a drummer. The locket lay here like a verdict. The Apache read her gaze and knew the shape of the hurt. He did not touch the shrine. He motioned her upward. They were halfway back when Raven's head snapped around again. This time no mule spoke in their favor. The feathered man raised the rifle and sighted along the barrel, slow and patient the way a hawk fixes on a rabbit. The sheriff turned with a frown as if to ask what Raven saw. The shot cracked across the gorge, and a chip of stone jumped where the Apache's hand had been a heartbeat before. The young woman slipped, caught a root, and hung there while pebbles rattled away into the dark. Men shouted below. The white scarf swung a lantern high, and its light slid along the wall toward them. The sheriff yelled to spread out. The ledger man grabbed a pistol with shaking hands. Raven worked the rifle bolt like a man opening a door he had waited years to enter. The Apache leaned down, reached for the young woman's wrist, and hauled her to the next ledge. He shoved the packet into her hands. "If I fall," he said, "take this to the riverhead man who carries the scar across his jaw. He will know what to do." "You will not fall," she said, choking on dust. "I have fallen before," he said, a ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I stand again." He turned as another shot rang and struck sparks from the rock beside his knee. He pulled her into a crevice, just as the lantern light washed over the wall. The sheriff's voice rose, fierce now. Raven answered with a laugh that held no humor. More men splashed across the ford upstream, the gorge filled with shapes and shouting. The Apache pressed his back against stone and measured the climb left above them. The young woman gripped the packet until her fingers ached and kept her eyes on the narrow strip of stars. Down below, Raven called out her old town by name and told the sheriff he held a new card. He said a roof could be bought or burned. He said a ghost could be made to talk if you held the right chain. The desert listened without judgment. The wind moved along the shelves in a slow keening. The night had gathered all the pieces of the conflict into one tight knot: the widow's trade, the sheriff's bargain, the traitor's feather, the lost locket, the chained man who refused to kneel. The next step was a handhold above the Apache's reach. He looked at the young woman, then at the open dark that waited if they slipped, then back again. He braced his shoulder and laced his fingers to lift her. Lanterns closer. A lantern's glow widened on the wall. The feathered rifle rose for a new shot. She set her foot in the Apache's hands and felt his strength lift her into the unknown. While voices below counted down to 1, the young woman's hands ached as she clung to the ledge. The rocks were sharp, and each breath she took sent pain through her ribs. Below, the shouts grew louder, echoing through the gorge like thunder rolling between walls. The Apache's grip tightened around her wrist, his muscles straining as he pulled her upward. The lantern light below flickered across his face, fierce, determined, alive. One more pull and she was on the narrow ledge beside him, both of them breathing hard. A rifle cracked again, the shot sparking off the rock near her head. She gasped, ducking instinctively. The Apache pressed her down, his arm shielding her as pebbles rained over them. "Move," he whispered. The circling. The canyon above them rose in tiers, jagged and steep. There was only one way up. He guided her hand to the next foothold, steady and patient, even as the danger closed in. The smell of gunpowder and dust filled the air. Down below, Raven barked orders, his voice calm but cold. He was a man used to hunting, and this chase was just another job to him. They climbed in silence. Each rock cut into their palms, each step a gamble against gravity. When they finally reached the upper ridge, the night wind hit them hard, carrying the scent of sage and smoke. The Apache crouched low, scanning the horizon. He pointed to a cluster of dark shapes moving along the lower trail riders. Raven's men were spreading out like wolves. The young woman's chest heaved. "They'll catch us before dawn." "Not if we vanish," he said. "How?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked toward the east, where the faintest streak of light hinted at morning. "There's an old path through the red cliffs. Only those who've walked it before can find it." She hesitated. "And you've walked it?" His jaw tightened. "Once when I was running from my own people." Before she could ask what he meant, he motioned for her to follow. They moved across the ridge, silent shadows against the pale stone. The desert below stretched endless and empty, but every gust of wind carried the promise of pursuit. By the time the first light touched the horizon, they reached a narrow fissure between the cliffs. The Apache led her inside, where the rock walls closed around them like a throat-swallowing light. The passage twisted and turned, forcing them to move sideways at times. It was cool inside, almost cold, and the air smelled of earth and water far below. She stumbled once, her foot catching on loose stones. He caught her arm before she fell. For a moment their eyes met in the dim light. His hand lingered just long enough for her to feel the warmth through the chill. "You're bleeding," he said softly, nodding to her palm. "It's nothing," she whispered, though the cut burned. "Pain reminds us we're still alive," he murmured, and let her go. They reached a wider chamber where sunlight streamed faintly through a crack above. The Apache stopped, listening. The young woman strained to hear it too, faint voices echoing far behind them. Raven's men had found the trail. He cursed under his breath. "They're faster than I thought." "What do? "We go deeper," he said. "This way." They slipped through another narrow tunnel, descending toward the sound of dripping water. The air grew damp, the walls slick with moss. The Apache's steps were sure, every turn deliberate. He moved like someone who had known this place long before it became a hiding ground. Finally, they emerged into a hidden hollow, where a spring bubbled between the rocks. The water glowed pale blue in the thin light filtering from above. The Apache knelt beside it, touching the surface with his fingers. "This place belongs to no one," he said. "Even the soldiers don't know it exists." The young woman sank onto a rock, her body trembling with exhaustion. "Will they find us here?" "Not easily," he said. But his voice carried no certainty. He glanced toward the passage they'd come from, "But they will keep looking." Raven doesn't leave a hunt unfinished. She looked at him, studying the sharp angles of his face. "You've met him before, haven't you?" He nodded slowly. "Once when I still believed the land could be shared. He came to the camp with false promises, said he would bring peace between our people and the settlers. But peace was just a word he sold to whoever paid most." She swallowed. "And you trusted him?" "I trusted the idea of peace," he said, eyes distant. "That was my mistake." A silence fell between them. Only the water broke it, whispering softly as it flowed over stone. The young woman reached for the packet he had given her earlier. "The papers you took, they could expose everything. The widow, the sheriff, all of them." He nodded. "If they reach the right hands, then we have to get them to your people." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "If they see you, they may not listen." "Then you'll speak for me," she said, her voice steady. "You said they would listen to truth." He studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Truth is heavier than stone. Sometimes it crushes those who carry it." Before she could answer, a noise echoed through the passage, faint, distant, but unmistakable. The crack of a boot against stone. The Apache's head snapped toward the sound. He motioned for her to stay low. The voices grew louder, bouncing through the tunnels. Raven's men had found the way in. The Apache moved silently to the edge of the chamber, pressing his ear to the rock. He turned back to her, his eyes dark with urgency. "There's another exit. But it's narrow and high." She rose to her feet. "Show me." He led her through a winding tunnel that climbed steeply. The walls grew tighter until she had to crawl, her hands scraping against the stone. Behind them, the echoes of pursuit drew closer, laughter boots, the jangle of metal. At last they reached a small opening that looked out over the desert. The drop below was steep but not impossible. The Apache tested the edge, then turned to her. "Go first," he said. She shook her head. "You go." I won't leave you behind." A faint smile crossed his lips. "Stubborn, alive," she said. Before he could reply, a shot rang out from behind them. The bullet sparked against the rock, filling the tunnel with smoke. She ducked instinctively, coughing. The Apache grabbed her, pulling her toward the opening. "Now," he shouted. She climbed out, the sun blinding her. The rock beneath her hands was hot. She scrambled down a few feet, then looked up. The Apache was still inside, returning fire with a pistol taken from one of the dead soldiers back in the gorge. "Go!" he shouted again, but she couldn't move. She saw the shadow of a man behind him, Raven, his rifle leveled. Gosh! There was no hesitation in his stance, no mercy in his eyes. The Apache turned just in time. The two men locked eyes, old betrayal burning between them. Raven smiled faintly, tilting his head. "You should have stayed in chains," he said. The Apache fired first, the sound splitting the air. Raven stumbled but didn't fall. He raised his rifle, aiming again. The young woman screamed his name, the first sound that tore through her since the chase began. The Apache glanced toward her for just a heartbeat, enough for Raven to fire. The bullet struck the wall beside him, throwing shards of rock across his face. He dropped behind cover, clutching his side. She started climbing back up. "I'm not leaving you. Don't," he shouted, blood streaking his arm. "Take the papers. Run to the ridge." She hesitated, torn between instinct and reason. Below, the desert stretched wide and merciless, a wasteland that offered no safety. Above, the cave mouth filled with smoke as Raven's men fired blindly. The Apache fired again, hitting one of them. The man fell back, screaming, but there were too many. Raven's voice cut through the chaos, cold and certain. "Alive or dead, I want them both." The young woman forced herself down the slope, sliding over loose stones, clutching the packet tight against her chest. Behind her, the gunfire echoed, fading as she ran. The desert wind roared in her ears, carrying her name, or maybe it was just the echo of fear. When she reached the foot of the ridge, she collapsed behind a boulder, gasping for breath. Her hands shook so badly the papers almost slipped from her grip. She looked up at the cave. Smoke billowed from the opening, black against the morning sky. Then silence. Her chest tightened. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't be gone." A moment later, a figure appeared at the edge of the cliff. The Apache. He was limping, but alive. Relief flooded her, until she saw Raven step out behind him, rifle raised. Neither spoke. They stood on the narrow ledge, two men bound by history, by betrayal, by something that went deeper than hate. Wind whipped around them, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Down below, the young woman rose slowly, her eyes fixed on the ledge. The papers pressed against her chest felt suddenly heavier, as if the truth inside them carried a cost she had never imagined. She didn't know who would live or what the next moment would bring. All she knew was that the story wasn't over. Not yet. The desert waited. The wind howled. And somewhere between the echoes of the past and the fire of the present, the final reckoning was about to begin. The wind screamed across the ridge, carrying the dust of the desert and the weight of all that had happened. The Apache stood bleeding at the edge, his stance steady, even as the ground beneath him trembled. Across from him, Raven leveled his rifle, the barrel glinting in the early light. For a moment everything seemed frozen, the air, the sound, the world itself holding its breath. The young woman watched from below, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the wind. She could see both men outlined against the rising sun, one fighting for his honor, the other for the greed that had long swallowed his soul. She wanted to shout, to run, to do something that could change what was about to happen, but her voice refused to come. Raven spoke first, his voice low but sharp as a knife. "You could have lived quiet," he said. "You could have forgotten the past." The Apache's answer came steady. "A man who forgets his people has no life worth keeping." Raven smirked. "Then you'll die with them." He pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked, the echo shattering the silence. Dust flew from the edge of the rock, but when it cleared, the Apache was still standing. He had moved just in time, the bullet grazing his shoulder. In one swift motion, he raised his pistol and fired. The shot hit true. Raven staggered, dropping the rifle as his knees buckled. He looked shocked, not at the pain, but at the fact that the man he once betrayed had beaten him. He fell backward, the wind taking his hat as his body tumbled down the cliffside, disappearing into the dust below. Apache stood still, breathing hard, the pistol lowering slowly at his side. The desert was quiet again. Only the wind moved. The young woman ran toward the ridge, her steps slipping on the loose stones. When she reached him, she saw how pale he'd become, how his blood stained the sand at his feet. She reached for him, but he shook his head. "It's done," he said softly. "The hunt is over." She pressed a hand to his wound. "You're hurt." He gave a faint smile. "It will heal." The land always heals slower than men, but stronger in the end. She felt tears burning her eyes, though she didn't fully understand why. Maybe it was relief, or maybe it was the weight of everything they had survived. She looked down at the packet still clutched in her hand. "The papers," she whispered. "They'll prove everything. The widow, the sheriff, what they did." He nodded. "You must take them to the riverhead, man. Tell him what we saw. Tell him the truth of what they've stolen." She hesitated. "Come with me. We'll bring them together." He looked out over the valley where Raven had fallen, his expression calm, almost distant. "My path ends here," he said quietly. "If I go with you, they will see only an outlaw. But if I stay, they will know the chains are broken." "You're not alone," she said, her voice trembling. He turned to her then, and there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a softness beneath the fire. "I was," he said, "till you freed me." She shook her head, refusing to let the moment slip into goodbye. "You saved me too." He didn't argue. He only looked at her for a long while, the way a man looks at something he wants to remember when the light fades. Then he pressed something into her hand, a small stone carved with an eagle's feather. "The desert keeps its promises," he said. "Follow the river at dawn. It will lead you to them." Before she could speak, he turned and began to walk down the ridge, moving toward the horizon where the land met the sky. His steps were slow but steady, leaving a faint trail of red behind him. She watched until he disappeared into the shimmering heat, a lone figure swallowed by the sun. For a long time, she stood there in silence, clutching the stone in one hand and the packet in the other. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying the echoes of the drums she had heard that first night, now distant, mournful, but not angry. It was as if the land itself was saying farewell. When she finally made her way to the river, the sun was already high. The water shimmered like glass, and on the opposite bank, a group of riders waited. They wore feathers and beads, their faces painted in solemn colors. Among them was an older man with a scar across his jaw, just as the Apache had said. She held up the packet and called across the water. "He sent me." The men exchanged glances. Then the one with the scar rode forward, his eyes steady on hers. He motioned for her to cross. She waded into the river, the current cold and strong around her legs, but she didn't stop until she reached him. She handed him the papers, her hands trembling. He opened them slowly, scanning the pages, ledgers, signatures, maps marked with stolen land and buried trade routes. His expression didn't change, but his eyes grew darker. When he finished, he looked at her. "He trusted you," he said simply. She nodded. "He said you'd know what to do." The man folded the papers carefully and tucked them inside his vest. "The truth will travel now," he said. "We'll find those who need to hear it." She looked past him, searching the horizon. "Will he come back?" The man was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "Some men belong to the earth more than to people. When the earth calls, they go." Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe he'd survived, that he was out there somewhere beneath the wide sky, watching the land he had fought to protect. She wanted to believe his story wasn't finished. But deep down she knew some stories don't end with words. They end with silence carried by the wind. Days passed. The soldiers came to the town looking for answers, but found none. The widow's freight wagons were gone, her saloon burned to the ground, and her name vanished from every ledger. The sheriff disappeared one night, his office left unlocked and empty. People whispered that justice had come from the desert, quiet and unseen, but final. The young woman stayed near the river, helping the tribes rebuild what had been taken. She learned to listen more than she spoke, to read the land the way the Apache had. Each morning, she walked to the ridge where the water bent east and left a small stone carved with a feather. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned copper, she heard a sound that made her stop. The cry of a hawk, sharp and clear, echoing across the canyon. She looked up and saw it circling high above the cliffs, its wings glinting in the fading light. A smile touched her lips. She whispered, "You kept your promise." The river shimmered beneath the setting sun, and the wind carried the faint rhythm of drums, not of war this time, but of peace, the kind that comes after everything has been lost and found again. She turned back toward the camp, her steps lighter, her heart steady. The world had changed, not through force or fury, but through truth and courage. The land would heal, just as he said it would. And somewhere beneath the endless sky of the old frontier, the Apache walked alone, free, unchained, and finally at peace.